AirBNB Arbitrage is a business model that a lot of people who are in or would like to be in the short-term or vacation rental business are looking at. We're going to look at whether or not that's actually a correct name for this kind of a business model. We're going to look at how one works, and then I'm going to share with you some of the risks that could be inherent in operating a business of this nature. So let's get started. Do the terms Airbnb and arbitrage together accurately describe what goes on in an Airbnb arbitrage, also called a rental arbitrage sometimes? Well, let's look at the two terms individually first. Airbnb is obviously one of the most recognizable marketing companies in the vacation and short-term rental industry. And a lot of people ask, well, we know what B&B stands for, bed and breakfast, but what's the Air stand for? Well, in the origination of the business, they were renting out mattresses in their living room, and they were using air mattresses for their guests. And when the guest would leave, they would deflate the mattress and clear it out of their living room. They got their room back, and when the next guest came, they inflated a mattress, and boom, they had a bed to rent out. So the Air in Airbnbs stands for actually air bed and breakfast. Now you know. Arbitrage is a word commonly used in financial companies, big banks, and it means to trade without risk. And many financial institutions actually have an arbitrage department that does nothing but look for opportunities to trade with reduced risk or no risk at all. And let's look at an example. Let's say we're working in the arbitrage department of a large financial firm, and our area of focus is precious metals. One day we find that in Tokyo we can buy gold at $800 an ounce. Well, we're also monitoring other markets, and we see that in London there's more of a demand for gold. So in London we could sell that same gold for $825 an ounce. That sets up, if we were to buy in Tokyo, sell in London at the same time, that we could profit $25 an ounce, obviously minus any minor transaction fees. So that sets up an arbitrage where we buy and sell at the same time and come out with a profit. That is a classic arbitrage. Is an Airbnb arbitrage the same as this financial arbitrage? Not even close, not even in the same universe. So how does an Airbnb arbitrage work? An Airbnb operator will say, well, I need a property that I can rent out, short-term vacation rentals, let's say, and they go to a landlord who has a property for rent in an area where there is demand for a short-term rental, for a vacation rental, and says to the landlord, hey, I want to rent your property. I'll sign a 1-year lease, pay whatever rent and security deposit and other costs that might be involved. I'm going to stock the place just as I would any other Airbnb. I'll put in beds, furniture, kitchen utensils, all the things that an Airbnb guest would expect to find. And then they will rent out that or operate that property as an Airbnb, and they'll charge enough on their Airbnb rates so that it covers the rent and all those other expenses. So, is there any risk in doing so? Yes, there is, and we're going to go over those. Let's look at the 5 most common risks involved if we want to start or operate a short-term rental business, an Airbnb arbitrage. The first one is legal, and that is simply the ability to operate a short-term rental business in the area where we want to operate. Many communities are restricting short-term rentals, and even though when you start your business, everything may be fine, if the community decides they don't want them anymore, there is a risk that you could be shut down at some point in the future when the community decides to make short-term rentals illegal in whatever fashion they do it. The second risk is lack of availability, and that can hit an operator in a couple different ways. The first being, of course, just finding landlords that are willing to not only allow an operator to sublet their property, but also to operate it as a short-term rental. Most landlords will not do that. The other side of the risk is, what if after a year the landlord decides they're going to sell the property? They don't like renting it out on a sublet / vacation rental operation because they are tired of getting complaints from neighbors about people that are constantly having parties in the house, people that are coming and going at all hours, or that are causing a lot of traffic and parking problems. So they just say, no, I'm just not going to renew the lease. And then the operator who has put a lot of money into advertising, into taking care of the property and stocking it with all the things required by a short-term rental, they now have to go find another property. The third risk, setup costs. Now, the short-term rental setup costs are probably not that much different from a long-term rental that is furnished, but you are going to pay, since you're now operating a business, you're going to have to get additional insurance, and you are probably going to need to get a business license wherever the property is located. Risk number 4, variable operating costs. And these don't necessarily need to be any different than long-term rental operating costs. But as I mentioned with the third risk, they can fluctuate. And because you're having more people coming and going, you're going to have more wear and tear than you would in a normal long-term rental. So those have to be taken into consideration. Risk number 5 is fluctuations in market demand. And there's a couple ways to look at that. One is, if you're in a location that is trendy, where trends come and go, and you happen to be making a pretty good rate of bookings based upon the popularity of what happens to be in that area, that popularity might wane at some point and you might not be as profitable. I'll give you an example. If you go back in ancient American history to the 1970s and 80s, John Travolta made a movie called Saturday Night Fever, and all of a sudden it was cool to be in the city and dancing. Well, John Travolta's career went on, and later he made a movie called Urban Cowboy, which was very rural, cowboy oriented. And who benefited from that? Well, it became cool to wear a Stetson, walk around in boots. Everybody was doing it all across the country. And who were the short-term operators that made money off that? Well, your dude ranches, short-term rentals, resorts out in cowboy areas all across the western United States benefited from that trend. When that trend went away, they benefited not so much. So if you're in a trendy area, that could be a risk. Second type of problem that could come up with demand is, let's say you're in an area that's by an attraction, and I'm going to use Disneyland as an example. Let's say you're operating a short-term rental, a vacation rental near Disneyland, and Disneyland shuts down for 3 months for renovations. Now, we know Disneyland doesn't really do that, but smaller attractions might. And if you lose some of those attractions, maybe something has a fire and burns down, something that is a draw for the area, the hotels, resorts, and short-term rentals could suffer from a lack of demand during that period. So those are a couple risks having to do with market demand. Is an AirBNB arbitrage an arbitrage? Well, based on the 5 risks, and we haven't covered them all, but just the 5 most common, which could apply or may not apply to any particular situation. But given those risks that apply to most situations, most operations of short-term rental property, it is not an arbitrage. AirBNB arbitrage is just a name. But now you know how they work. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.